I have been in the World Bank for 18 years. This is my 19th. And we have a sense that we are where we were 18 years ago when I read the literature about poverty and you know, how things are getting worse and so on. But then we're always talking about how we could use technology to leapfrog, to help the African continent leapfrog. When I finally left the African continent, the African region of the World Bank, where I spent most of my time in the bank, and came into this new space called the World Bank Institute, I started asking myself how I could contribute, how, as an individual, I could make a contribution to real development on the ground. How could I bring both my knowledge of development and the technology we're talking about, which would help the continent leapfrog, how do we bring the two together in a way that would bring development, peace, and security to the continent? That became a preoccupation of mine, and for the last 2 years I've been focusing very much on that. The first important recognition for me was the fact that there's a major information deficit across the continent. So how do we deal with that? There's an important democracy deficit in the continent. How do we deal with that? And there's serious problems of governance, economic governance. How do we deal with that? Because in my view, if we could address those three things, if we could address the information, the problem we have with access to information, if we could address the problem of governance, and if we could help evolve a more democratic culture on the continent, we would be answering some of the deeper problems that face Africa as a developing region of the world. So most of the work I've tried to do in the last couple of years has been to bridge that gap, to bring the two together. And what we did, my team and myself, ultimately was develop a program we call the IMAGE program, which is the independent media for accountability, governance, and empowerment. Because we thought those three words, accountability, governance, and empowerment, would do the trick. So ultimately the question became, how do we use existing technologies, how do we use traditional media, digital technologies, to achieve that objective? Accountability, governance, and empowerment of citizens. First of all, my background being in media, I naturally evolved in that direction and thought about how we could work with media across Africa to achieve those objectives. So that's one major area of the IMAGE program. The other aspect of the program naturally became, based on what we were seeing around us, how do we engage with citizens? And we then developed a program of citizen reporters. How do we empower citizen reporters to be part of this information dissemination activity that we thought was necessary? How do we empower citizens to become part of the governance agenda of these developing countries? So we've been working on that. My role essentially is one of training. And what we're trying to do is build a core of journalists in each country that will that will have, because presently the problem across most of Africa is we do not have media professionals that are equipped to package information in ways that citizens, populations can use them. So part of the problem is training, providing these journalists the means to package information that's available on the web, available through those institutions that work on development in these countries, there's a lot of information out there that citizens are not getting. I just came back from Rwanda, and I was talking to a group of journalists on agriculture in Rwanda. Well, actually, there were 7 countries present, and we're talking about agriculture in those countries. And these are all countries that depend, in various degrees, on agriculture for their for the GDP growth in the country. And of the 80+ journalists who were present, only one of them had any regular, had regularly reported on agriculture. One of 80 journalists. And when we discussed, when we took, say, Rwanda, the example I was going to give, where 80% of its GDP comes from agriculture, but only 8% of its budget, 8% of its budget is allocated to agriculture. Then, the journalists began to see the discrepancy between the two, and why it was important to begin to engage the nation in a conversation on agriculture. Why it was important to invest more in a sector that was so important to the national economy. But prior to this discussion, it had never been evident to any of the journalists why there should be more resources allocated to agriculture. So just the absence of that piece of information that could make such a significant difference in how the government approaches development, in how the nation sees its own prospects. That missing element, could make all the difference. And so what we're trying to do is to empower these journalists to be able to take information that's available and bring that information to citizens in ways that they could begin to, as informed citizens, begin to provide the basis for policies that could make a difference. Prior to this, and also now, I think a lot of resources were going to the military, for example, and I know I'm in a military base, I shouldn't be saying this, but a lot of countries were spending a lot on the military, and so much less on agriculture, so much less on infrastructure, so much less on other sectors of the economy that are critical to development. Until you have an informed discussion in each of these countries, I think we'll continue to have these skewed budgetary processes that inevitably result in outcomes that are anything but desirable. I'm sure if Egypt or Tunisia had the kind of discussions we're talking about, if the media in those countries, if citizen reporters in those countries had actually been engaged in a national conversation on the priorities of the country and how budgets should be allocated, I think we would have seen a whole different scenario than what we saw in earlier this year in those two countries, and certainly in the rest of the Arab world. So part of what we're trying to do is to first of all, and as I say, my background is media, so I tend to focus on media, but we're also looking at working, and we're doing this in collaboration with other international institutions like the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ. We're working to develop a core of citizen reporters across Africa who can then support what traditional media is doing. And of course, the way they would do this, the way citizen reporters would work is, essentially through using their mobile phones and the various applications that are available on their telephones. So developing that core of reporters who can then contribute to what the journalists do, and then ultimately help in sustaining an important national discussion on the critical issues of the country. That is what is not happening across Africa today. And you can't go into that continent and talk about security issues, talk about development issues, talk about growing the economy without that, bridging that gap, without opening up access to critical information that exists, but that citizens do not have. So in many ways, I would say that since I'm in a military environment, I really hope you can begin to see security and development not only as the work of the army in in a traditional sense, but how we use current technologies to make information available to citizens, information that is available, that usually is not a part of the national conversation. And I think that's the major challenge. I was very pleased in Rwanda to find out that the army in that country had shifted its focus from war with surrounding countries, especially the DRC, to war against food insecurity. I don't know if you know this, but that's what's happening in Rwanda today. The military in that country is focusing in a very unique way on helping the country deal with its problems of food insecurity. I visited a plantation of cassava, I don't know if you know, it's a tuber. It's a huge plantation, cassava plantation, run by the Rwandan army as part of its efforts to help the country deal with its problems of food insufficiency. So, and to do that effectively, they have introduced, they're in contact with farmers across the country. And that contact with farmers across the country is through mobile telephone applications. So again, the Rwandan army has been able to pull the two together. Current, digital technologies, a significant problem that the country has. They've moved some of the resources from the army into agriculture, and part of this is now becoming. And the reason we went there was to take the journalists to see this and to make that a part of what they do, a part of the discussion that they would help the country have and sustain.